The train's whistle was a long, mournful cry against the vast, sun-bleached sky of Nevada. It was the sound of departure, of finality, and for the young woman left standing on the dusty platform, it was the sound of her world ending. She stood perfectly still amidst the swirling chaos of porters and passengers, a splash of delicate pink silk in a world of brown dust and weathered wood. Her dress was high-collared and fitted in a way no one in the town of Redemption had ever seen, its color a defiant bloom against the harsh backdrop of her public humiliation. The man who was supposed to be her husband, a portly merchant named Walter Harrison, had taken one look at her, his face twisting into a sneer. He had spoken loudly for the benefit of the gathered crowd. "She is not what was described. Small, scrawny, and she brought no dowry worth mentioning." He had tossed a single silver dollar onto the platform at her feet, for her trouble. Then he had turned, boarded the eastbound train without a backward glance, and was gone. Now the silver dollar lay gleaming in the oppressive summer sun, a small, bright monument to her shame. The crowd, which had moments before been a collection of curious onlookers, was now a jury. They stared, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. The station master, a man with a drooping mustache and a permanent scowl, began to walk toward her. He gestured with his thumb. "You can't stay here, miss. Move along." She did not seem to understand his words, her dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the shimmering horizon. She held a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her hands, her only possession in this new, brutal country. Arthur Vance saw the whole thing from across the street, where he was loading a sack of feed into his wagon. He was a man accustomed to keeping to himself. His homestead was a good 10 miles out of town, a solitary existence carved from the unforgiving land. He came to Redemption only when necessary, for supplies and mail, and he never lingered. He had no time for town gossip, and even less for its casual cruelties. But this was different. It was the deliberate theatrical nature of the rejection that settled like a stone in his gut. It was the way Harrison had played to the crowd, turning a private arrangement into a public spectacle. He watched the station master get closer to the woman, his voice growing louder, more insistent. He saw the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her bundle. Something inside Arthur, some quiet, principled part of him that he rarely showed the world, refused to let it stand. He tied off the feed sack, wiped his dusty hands on his trousers, and walked across the street. His steps were slow and deliberate, the worn heels of his boots making soft thuds in the thick dust. The station master looked up, surprised, as Arthur stopped beside the woman in pink. "This ain't your business, Vance." Arthur ignored him. He looked at the woman. She was smaller up close, her face pale and still. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet his, were not filled with tears, but with a profound and weary stillness, like deep water. He didn't know a word of her language, and he guessed she knew just as little of his. So he used the universal language of the frontier, practicality. He gestured to himself. "Arthur." He then pointed toward his wagon, and then made a motion of eating. He pointed to her, then made a motion of stirring a pot. It was crude, clumsy, but it was the only thing he could think of. He needed someone to manage his house. It was a disaster of bachelorhood, a place where dust bred in the corners and his meals were a monotonous rotation of beans and salted pork. He was offering a job, nothing more. A roof in exchange for work. The station master scoffed. "What in blazes are you doing, Vance? She's Harrison's problem." "Harrison's on a train," Arthur said, his voice low and even, his gaze never leaving the woman's face. "Looks to me like she's nobody's problem, and I need a cook." The woman watched his hands, then looked into his eyes, searching for something. He held her gaze, trying to convey what he couldn't say, that he meant no harm, that this was a straightforward proposition. He wasn't offering charity, but a trade. Her dignity for his comfort. After a long moment, a moment in which the entire platform seemed to hold its breath, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur bent down, picked up the silver dollar Harrison had thrown, and pressed it into the station master's hand. For her ticket, he said, though he knew she had no ticket and nowhere to go. It was a gesture, a way of closing the books on the public ledger of her humiliation. He then picked up her small bundle and turned toward his wagon. He did not look back to see if she was following. He simply trusted that she would. A few seconds later, he heard the soft, rustling sound of her silk dress and the light fall of her cloth-soled shoes in the dust behind him. The town of Redemption watched them go, their whispers following them like a swarm of unseen insects. Arthur Vance did not yet know that this simple act of decency, born of a stubborn refusal to abide cruelty, had just irrevocably altered the course of his life. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, the silence of his homestead might be broken by a sound other than the wind. The ride to his property was a silent one. The sun beat down on the wagon, and the heat rose in shimmering waves from the parched earth. Arthur kept his eyes on the rumps of his two sturdy mules, feeling the woman's presence beside him as a tangible thing. She sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap over her bundle, her gaze fixed forward. She did not flinch at the bumps and ruts in the road, her composure as smooth and unyielding as the silk of her dress. When they finally arrived, Arthur saw his homestead through her eyes for the first time. It wasn't much. A small, clapboard house that leaned slightly to the west, a sturdy barn, a corral, and a well, all of it surrounded by miles of open land, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stubborn juniper tree. It was a lonely place, a place built for survival, not comfort. The dust was everywhere, a fine red powder that coated every surface inside and out. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to her. He helped her down from the wagon seat, his hand briefly touching the strange, smooth fabric of her sleeve. It felt out of place here, like a flower blooming in a desert. He led her inside. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. A cast-iron stove stood cold in one corner, a rough-hewn table and two chairs in the center. A layer of dust lay over everything. A stack of dirty plates sat by the wash basin. It was the home of a man who worked from sun-up to sundown and fell into his bed exhausted, with no energy left for domestic arts. He felt a sudden sharp pang of embarrassment. He pointed to the stove, the pantry, the small bedroom that would be hers. "You stay here," he said, gesturing to the room. "I'll be in the barn." He felt a powerful need to escape, to let her acclimate to this rough new reality on her own. He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. For the next hour he worked in the barn, mending a piece of tack, his mind a churn of uncertainty. He had acted on impulse, a thing he rarely did. What had he just done? He had brought a foreign woman, a woman disgraced and abandoned, into his home, a woman who couldn't speak his language. The whispers in town would grow into a roar. Harrison was a man with money and influence. He would not appreciate Arthur Vance interfering. But what he found when he returned to the house silenced his doubts. A fire was crackling in the stove, a pot of water already heating. The dirty dishes were gone, washed and stacked. The table had been wiped clean. The woman, who he had decided to call May until he could learn her real name, was sweeping the floor with a quiet, efficient grace, her movements economical and precise. The ridiculous pink dress was gone, replaced by a simple, dark tunic and trousers she must have had in her bundle. She looked smaller without the finery, but also more capable, more grounded. She glanced up as he entered, her expression unreadable, and then returned to her work. Arthur stood in the doorway, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He had offered her a job as a cook, but she was already transforming the very air of the place. That evening he sat down to a meal that made him question every meal he had ever eaten before. From his meager supplies of salt pork, beans, flour, and a few withered onions, she had created something remarkable. The pork was simmered with herbs she must have carried with her, rendering it tender and fragrant. The beans were rich and savory. She had even made a kind of flat, savory bread on the stove top. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of their forks and the crackle of the fire. He watched her as she ate. She was deliberate, her posture perfect, her focus entirely on her food. There was a dignity about her that seemed unshakable. He had seen her at her lowest moment, publicly cast aside. Yet here she was, creating order and beauty from the chaos of his life. He began to understand that he hadn't rescued her. He had hired a force of nature. The days settled into a new rhythm. Arthur would rise before dawn and head to the barn. When he returned for his midday meal, the house would be clean, and a hot, delicious meal would be waiting on the table. In the evenings they would eat together in their customary silence. Slowly, tentatively, they began to communicate. He would point to an object and say its name. Table. Water. Horse. She would listen, her head tilted, and then repeat the word in a soft, musical voice. She, in turn, would teach him words from her own language, pointing to the spices she used, the vegetables she coaxed from a small patch of dirt she had tilled behind the house. Her garden was a miracle. The soil was hard and dry, but she tended it with a fierce devotion, watering it from the well, bucket by bucket. Soon green shoots pushed through the red dirt. She was not just a cook, she was a creator, someone who could bring life and flavor to a barren landscape. His life, which had been a cycle of hard labor and exhaustion, now had a center. It had a clean house, good food, and a quiet, steady presence. He found himself looking forward to coming in from the fields, wondering what new culinary magic she would have performed. He started bringing her things from town, not just supplies, but small offerings. A bag of better flour, a few precious potatoes, a length of simple calico fabric. He left them on the table without a word, and she would accept them with a small, grateful nod. The town, however, had not forgotten. When Arthur went for supplies a few weeks later, he felt the change. The usual gruff greetings were replaced by cold stares. Men would stop talking when he entered the general store. The owner, a man named Jeb, served him with a stony face. As Arthur was loading his wagon, 2 men stepped out from the alley beside the saloon. They were men who worked for Harrison, hired muscle known for their brutishness. "Vance," the bigger one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Arthur's boot. "Mr. Harrison ain't happy. You took something that belonged to him." "She's a person, not a piece of property," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. He did not stop his work. "That ain't how he sees it," the man sneered. "He wants her back. Or at least, he wants what she was supposed to bring him." Arthur paused, turning to face them. "Then he can come and ask for it himself." The man took a step closer, puffing out his chest. "That ain't a good idea, farmer. We can be real persuasive." Arthur didn't tense. He didn't reach for the shotgun he kept under the wagon seat. He just looked at the man, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was the same look he used on a spooked horse, calm and absolute. There was no fear in it, and that unnerved the bully more than any threat could have. After a long, tense moment, the man grunted and backed away, pulling his partner with him. "This ain't over," he called over his shoulder. Arthur watched them go before finishing his loading, but as he drove the wagon out of town, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He knew the man was right. This was far from over. He saw the way May watched the horizon when she thought he wasn't looking, as if waiting for a threat she knew was coming, and he understood her silence was not fear, but a different kind of strength. One evening, after a particularly violent summer thunderstorm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool, Arthur found May sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the newly washed landscape. The sky was a bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. He brought out 2 mugs of chicory coffee and sat on the step beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. She had been with him for over 2 months. The garden was thriving. The house felt like a home. His world had been transformed by her quiet presence, yet he knew almost nothing about her. He knew she was a genius with food, that she was tirelessly hard-working, and that she possessed a core of inner strength that he deeply admired. But the reason for her public shaming remained a mystery. He finally found the courage to ask. "Harrison," he said, the name sounding ugly in the peaceful twilight. "Why?" He made a gesture of pushing something away. "Why did he send you away?" She was silent for a long time, staring into her mug. He thought she might not answer, that he had crossed a line. When she finally spoke, her English was still hesitant, but clearer than it had ever been. "He wanted gold," she said softly. "My family. No more gold." She set her mug down and went inside, returning a moment later with the cloth-wrapped bundle she had been carrying at the train station. He had not seen it since the day she arrived. She sat back down and with careful fingers untied the knot. She folded back the cloth. Inside was not jewelry or coins. It was a collection of small, intricately embroidered silk pouches. She opened one and tipped a small amount of a fragrant reddish powder into her palm. She opened another, revealing dried leaves and tiny star-shaped pods. One by one she opened them all, a treasure trove of spices and herbs, their exotic scents rising into the cool night air. "This," she said, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, "was my dowry." She explained in a slow, careful mix of English words and expressive gestures. Her family had been renowned chefs for generations in their province. They had owned a famous restaurant, their patrons wealthy merchants and officials. But political winds had shifted. A new governor had seized their property, and they had lost everything. They had used the last of their money to send her to America, to marry Harrison, a man they knew only through letters and a handsome photograph. The arrangement was their last hope. Her dowry was not gold, but the accumulated knowledge of her ancestors, the rare spices and secret recipes that were the source of their fame and fortune. It was a dowry of skill, of art. To Walter Harrison, a man who measured the world in dollars and cents, this was an insult. He had expected a bride who would bring him wealth. Instead, he got a woman whose only treasure was her talent. He had not seen a skilled artist. He had seen a liability. His public rejection was not just about his disappointment. It was a calculated act to destroy her reputation, to ensure no one else in the territory would see any value in her either. Arthur stared at the small pouches of spice, the air thick with their scent. He felt a wave of cold fury toward Harrison, followed by a profound sense of awe for the woman sitting next to him. She had offered a king's ransom, and the fool had thrown it away because he was too blind to see its worth. He looked at her proud, straight back, and the quiet sorrow in her eyes. He thought of the incredible meals she created from next to nothing, the life she had coaxed from the barren soil, the order she had brought to his chaotic existence. It all made sense now. He reached out, his calloused finger gently touching one of the silk pouches. "Can you cook?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was the first question he had ever asked her, back at the train station, a crude, practical question born of his own needs. Now he asked it again, but this time it was filled with reverence. It was not a question about her ability to perform a task. It was an acknowledgment of her identity, her history, her art. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She looked at him, and for the first time she offered him a small, genuine smile. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I can cook." That single word, spoken in the quiet of the Nevada twilight, was more intimate than any touch. It was a bridge built between two worlds, a confirmation of shared understanding. He was speechless, not because of what she said, but because of everything it meant. In that moment, Arthur Vance knew he was not just protecting a hired cook. He was standing beside an artist, a survivor, a woman of immense worth. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would let no one harm her. The next day a rider appeared on the horizon. It was not Harrison, but his lawyer, a slick man from Reno named Peterson, accompanied by two of the same hired men from town. They rode right up to the house, their horses trampling a corner of May's garden. Arthur met them on the porch, his stance relaxed but ready. May stood in the doorway behind him, a silent shadow. "Mr. Vance," Peterson said, not bothering to dismount, "I am here on behalf of my client, Mr. Harrison. There has been a misunderstanding. Mr. Harrison is prepared to overlook your impetuous actions and take the woman, as per the original agreement." "The agreement was broken," Arthur said calmly, "on the train platform, in front of the whole town." "A fit of pique," Peterson waved a dismissive hand. "He has reconsidered. In fact, he is so keen to rectify the situation that he is willing to offer you $200 for your trouble." Arthur almost laughed. $200 was more money than he saw in a year. It was a fortune. It was also an insult. "She's not for sale." Peterson's polite mask slipped. "Don't be a fool, Vance. Harrison is a powerful man. He has friends in the territorial government. He can make your life very difficult. He can challenge your homestead claim. He can ruin you." This was the true threat. Not fists and guns, but papers and laws wielded as weapons. His claim, his land, everything he had worked for, could be stripped away. It was a choice, her safety or his future. He didn't have to think about it. He looked back at May, who was watching him, her dark eyes steady. He saw not a cook or a victim, but his partner. "You can tell Mr. Harrison," Arthur said, his voice ringing with a finality that echoed across the yard, "that he is not welcome on this land. Not now, not ever. Now get off my property." Peterson's face flushed with anger. "You will regret this," he hissed, wheeling his horse around. The two hired men glared at Arthur, but they followed their employer, kicking up a cloud of dust as they rode away. When they were gone, a heavy silence fell. Arthur turned to May. The cost of his decision hung in the air between them. He had just declared war on a man who could crush him. May stepped out onto the porch. She walked to the corner of her garden where the horses' hooves had torn up the earth. She knelt, her slender fingers gently riding a bruised squash plant, firming the soil around its roots. She did not look at him. She simply began to repair the damage. Arthur watched her, and something loosened in his chest. He had made his choice, and he did not regret it. He walked over, knelt beside her, and began to help. They worked together, side by side in the dirt, their hands moving in a shared, silent purpose. They would face what was coming, together. 3 months passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. A letter arrived from the Territorial Land Office. It was a formal challenge to Arthur's claim, filed by an anonymous party, citing improper filing and failure to make required improvements. It was Harrison's work, a slow, legal poison designed to bleed him dry. But the town of Redemption had a long memory. They had seen Harrison's cruelty on the platform, and they had heard the stories of his attempts to intimidate Arthur. Frontier communities had their own code, and while they were suspicious of outsiders, they despised a bully. When Arthur went to town, the store owner, Jeb, quietly slipped him a bag of coffee beans on the house. The blacksmith offered to reshoe his mules for free. People who had once stared at him with cold suspicion now met his eyes with a nod of grudging respect. They saw a man who had stood his ground for a principle, and they approved. May's presence had also worked a subtle magic. The wife of the circuit judge, a woman who suffered from terrible stomach ailments, had heard whispers of May's cooking. She came to the homestead one day, desperate. May prepared her a simple, fragrant broth. The next week, the judge's wife returned, looking better than she had in years, and carrying a basket of fresh eggs and a bolt of wool cloth as thanks. The story spread. May was no longer the shamed foreigner. She was the woman with the healing touch in her kitchen. Arthur and May worked tirelessly to fight the claim. With the help of the circuit judge, who offered advice as a friend, Arthur drafted a response, documenting every fence post he'd sunk, every acre he'd cleared. May's thriving garden, now overflowing with produce they sold in town, was the most powerful evidence of all. It was a living testament to their hard work and their right to be there. The claim was eventually dismissed. Harrison, having lost face and legal standing, sold his interests in Redemption and was never seen again. One cool evening in late autumn, Arthur found May by the corral, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her simple dark work clothes could not diminish the quiet grace she possessed. Over the past months, their silent partnership had deepened into a bond of profound trust and affection. He had come to rely not just on her cooking or her housekeeping, but on her steady, calming presence. He could not imagine his life without her. He held something in his hand. It was a small, simple ring he had bought from a traveling tinker, paid for with the money from their first vegetable sale. It wasn't gold or silver, just polished brass, but it was honest. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time, just watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. "May," he said, his voice a little rough. She turned to him, her face soft in the twilight. He held out the ring. "I know it's not much," he began, fumbling for the words, "but this homestead, it's not just my home anymore. It's ours. If you'll have it. If you'll have me." She looked from the ring to his face, her eyes searching his. He saw no hesitation there, only a deep, knowing warmth. She didn't say yes. Instead, she took the ring and slid it onto her finger. Then she reached out and placed her small, work-roughened hand in his. Her touch was a confirmation, a promise, an answer to a question he hadn't even known how to ask. They stood there together as the stars came out, hand in hand, two solitary people who had found in each other a place to belong. The house behind them was warm and bright, a beacon of light in the vast, darkening plains. It was a home built not on a dowry of gold, but on a foundation of shared work, mutual respect, and a quiet, unshakable kindness. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.